Hello, Dr. Winkler again. This is lecture number 14 for the World War I class. If we were meeting in person, sometimes I like to start the class by loosening everybody up, talk a little bit about your favorite sport or what's happening with the local football programs, all those kind of things. Can't really do that. Nothing's really going on right now. Another thing sometimes I'll do is I'll try to tell a joke. Unfortunately, my jokes are very bad. My delivery leaves a lot to be desired. Sometimes I'll turn to my students and say, well, do you have any jokes? Anybody got a good joke? Silence. Sometimes I do learn some pretty interesting things from that experience. Nonetheless, we are talking about the First World War, and we need to progress with our discussion. Last time we were talking about the Western Front. Now I'm going to say a lot more about the Western Front as this class continues. But I want to just very slightly repeat some of the things I said. Remember I talked about the estimates as to the actual number of miles that are involved in the trenches. Remember 12,000 miles is one estimate. Other estimates would double that to get to 25,000. Let me put that in perspective. It's about 25,000 miles around the Earth at the equator. So the 25,000 miles is correct. The trench lines would literally, had they been stretched out, would go around the Earth. Even if it's only 12,000 miles. What is it, 3,000 miles across the United States? From sea to shining sea, 3,000 miles, back again, back again, back again. This gives you an idea as to the extent of the length, I should say, of the trench system. Went into a lot of detail talking about poison gas. After making a big discussion of this, remember I came down and said, well, as important as it was, we can largely say that the effect was overrated. It is something different in warfare. It's something we don't see repeated in the Second World War. It adds another level of misery and fear and death to the front itself. But its actual impact on the war is not huge. In fact, we're going to argue that's relatively minor. As I mentioned last time, about 1% of the fatalities came from gas during the war, while other weapons, much higher percentages. Few lingering effects. I mentioned that when men were applying in Britain for compensation for their disabilities, having received during the war. It's largely in the 1920s. Very few of them put down any statement that I have the lingering effects of gas. Now, I did mention Adolf Hitler, with lingering effects, couldn't stand smoke, couldn't take the test of meat, probably. There's another man, a British actor named Claude Rains. If you're into old-time movies, and I pretty much am, he played the corrupt French official in the brilliant movie Casablanca. And everybody has two eyes, as you all know. One of his eyes was almost completely blind. He could see almost nothing out of it all because of gas in the First World War. He made many other fine motion pictures as well. So to say there's no lingering effects from gas is somewhat misleading. On the other hand, its effectiveness and its lethality is overrated. Let's take a look at France. Look at French futility in 1915. I was just starting this last time. Remember I said I went to a historical museum in Paris where they're showing the entire Western Front, and this is what the French were doing year by year, including 1915, grabbing a few miles here and there, trying to push the Germans out of France. 1915, this was completely unsuccessful. You do grab a few square miles at very, very high cost. I was talking to you also about the need to new ideas. One of the problems with a trench system, literally going 475 miles, roughly, give or take, from the English Channel to the Swiss border. If you're fighting an enemy, how do you turn the flank? Isn't that good strategic sense? Your army's here, frontal assaults are going to be challenging. Let's maneuver. Let's find a way of turning the flank. Let's find a way of getting around the edge, coming out, hitting them on a side that they're not expecting it, so you don't have to have these costly frontal assaults. This is common practice by very clever military people, going back for many, many years. But on an extended front like that, how do you turn the flank? There's really no way to do this. You've got to figure out a way of punching through. You've got to figure out a way of having advanced weapons. We'll talk about the tank and other things later on. But was there really a chance to maneuver? Was there a chance that you could draw your enemies out? Now, once again, this is a guy talking 100 years after the war's over. And of course, I mulled over this. Well, of course, the Germans in 1918 are going to figure out how to break through, and we'll talk about that when we get to it. But is there anything you could do to change the scenario? Can't find a flank to turn it. Well, this is total speculation by an old man, happens to be me. Could maneuver. Let's say you're sitting at the front, and your enemy is across there. Withdraw. I mean, the front lines, as you know, I already talked about this in the Race to the Sea. They tend to be very close together, literally a few hundred yards. Does vary considerably depending exactly where you are on the front, but you're quite close together. So you're constantly in contact, machine guns, artillery pieces, almost all the time. What if you simply withdrew? You pull back to a hill or city or someplace beyond the reach of this constant combat. Is it possible you could bait your enemies into attacking? Wow, it's wide open, isn't it? Well, if it's wide open, then actually out in the fields again, of course, the artillery and machine guns are still going to force you to go to ground pretty fast. But could you have baited somebody? You said, well, it's open. It withdrew. Let's go out there and push our forces. And in other words, leave the trenches and go out and engage in combat in a more open scenario. The problem with my kind of thinking is this. Always try to think about the negative of your opinion. So let's look at the negative of my opinion. If the French try this, why the Germans don't take the bait? Remember, the Germans are thinking to a certain extent that they're going to hold in the west and hit in the east. Therefore, major offensives, there's only a few, 3, until 1918. The Germans might just simply go, well, this is great. We'll just sit here and watch you people out in the fields. Since you're not putting pressure on us, there's no reason for us to come out. If they're skillfully managed, however, maybe there's a possibility the Germans would have said, wow, there's a hole in the enemy's lines. Let's take advantage of it. If there was a real possibility of this, and I'm not saying that there was, it would probably have been more likely a tactic that the Germans would have tried. Because remember, the French and the British are pounding them a lot more on the Western Front than the Germans are pounding the French and British. The Germans had to withdraw, and well, maybe the British or French would have taken the bait, and then you'd been a scenario to maneuver. However, had the Germans done this, there's a real possibility that they would have to abandon the idea of we're holding the West. Any event, this is total speculation. But that does come back to my original statement. If you had thought this through maybe a little bit differently, there might have been a possibility of figuring out a way to maneuver. Let's come down here. Let's talk about the cost of the war. We usually say that France's losses included about 75% of their combat strength. The first 2 years, 1914, 1915, and shall we say halfway, 2 full years, halfway into 1916. The French losses, this is killed and wounded, would be about 3.2 million men. Okay, this is enormous, enormous loss. If you multiply that out, shall we say, take it beyond 2 years, you go to 5, and some sources will say 6 million men were lost, killed and wounded in 4 years, in the entire war, including 1.8 million dead. Almost, in this case, almost as many men were maimed. This is insane. This is physically disabled. This is blind. This is missing legs and arms. Permanently maimed. This is not an injury or a wound that you recover from. This is the one that keeps you debilitated, probably for the rest of your life. So you have 1.3 million maimed. These are huge numbers. They're literally horrific. Now, why am I picking on the French? I really can pick on other nations as well. The nation that had the highest percentage casualties in the war was not France. It was Austria-Hungary. I mean, of course, you gather in large numbers of prisoners in this number as well. So not just killed and wounded. But the Austrian Empire suffered something like 90% casualties. My goodness, this is absolutely huge. Remember, I talked to you earlier about the teeth-to-tail ratio. During the war, France had about 8 million men in uniform. Out of a nation of 40 million, that's a very, very high percentage. Of course, a lot of these men were middle-aged guys and old guys even, that were in support units. The combat units is largely where we're talking about the men actually up on the front being blown apart. These are the actual men, these are the actual losses we're talking about. The British did not suffer, percentage-wise, as large of casualties as did the French. So I could say, so I'm using France kind of a middle area. One of the reasons why I'm doing this is, in the reading I have done, it seems like we actually have more studies done which give us an idea as to the actual losses. And I don't have my glasses. Okay. If we were meeting in a classroom situation, I like to run these off. I know that's backwards and it's blurred, but this is a handout I would give to you as students. Since you really can't read it because you can't see it. It's in French. My French leaves a lot to be desired. But in any event, these are actual numbers that the French released. Remember, going way, way back in the early part of this class, I did argue that sometimes the casualty rates can be debated. And there are good reasons, sometimes good political reasons, to make sure that your enemy, that you are, shall we say, downplaying your numbers. However, I don't think France is downplaying the numbers in this case. Let's see what it says. August to September, first 2 months of the war, Battle of the Frontiers, Battle of the Marne, August, September 1914. The men who died out in the field itself, 313,000. Those who died in aid stations, if I'm reading this right, near the area, adds another 7,000 dead. And those who died later on in the hospital is 9,000. So you add that up and you're talking about 330,000. If you add October to November on top of that, that ends up being another 130,000. So the numbers actually, according to them, comes out to about 400,000. August through November. This is dead. Okay, then we go to December. Then the numbers go up dramatically. When you're fighting at Verdun, which I'll discuss later. And however, if you go down the entire list, you can see from this, the casualty figures early in the war are huge. If you go down to the end, and what you have is 1,528,000. So it's a little, not quite as high as this, is it? But it's pretty close. However, if you add on top of that those who died in the hospitals near the front and back to the front, you do end up with adding another 300,000 to that. So that's how I come up with this 1.8 million dead. Literally horrific. Okay, what does that actually mean to your nation? Now, France's population in 1914, I said that wrong, it's about 40 million. Maybe a little less, 39 point something million, anyway, roughly 40 million. So the population of France drops from 1914 to 1918 to 37 million. You say, well, Dr. Winkler, you're making a mistake here. 1.8 million dead does not mean a decrease in 3 million lives. That's true, but dad is at the front. Dad is not getting married to mom, so fewer children are born. Part of this decrease in number is a drop in birth rates during the war. Now, this is very common at the end of wars. Birth rates tend to go up at the end of wars. One of the reasons for this is, well, daddy does come home. On the other hand, you do want to replace sometimes, in memory of the fallen, you do want to replace them with somebody else, another child. So this is not uncommon, but however, in 1918, the French population of France has gone down quite significantly. So 37 million are alive and whole. Okay. Only 37 million are left that are still functioning well. Okay, men aged 21 to 34. Remember at the beginning of the war, the draft age in France is 21. It's 18 in other countries, 21 in France. As I've already mentioned, after they draft all the men who are 21, then they go the 20-year-olds and the 19-year-olds, 18-year-olds, and 17-year-olds. If you're in 1914 and you're a man of military age, this is prime military age, age 21 to 34, remember there's a very large percentage of your manpower, almost everybody who can serve does serve, is in the military. Of those, half are killed, half are maimed. Sometimes I use this as dramatic flair in a class like this. I'll ask the young men in my class, how many of you are between age 21 and 34? Well, that's a lot of people. A very large percentage of people are that age. Almost all the guys taking my class are about that age. So they raise their hands. And then I just arbitrarily look around the room and I'll go like this. I'll draw down and say, all you guys are dead. And all you guys are maimed. Now, that's a little bit of overkill because there were men who survived this whole. Actually, the way you actually survived the war, if you're in the trenches at these ages, was being wounded, not maimed, but being wounded. If you were wounded a few times, you could recover. Whatever the time of your convalescence, is the time you're not in the trenches. So that actually ups your odds of survivability. Many years ago, back in the 70s, I met an elderly English gentleman. And I believe he was like 78. He was born in 1900. I had to ask him, you would have been 18 in 1918. So did you serve in the military? No. You see, his birthday was late in 1900. So he didn't turn 18 until late in 1918. Can we say probably by just a few months, he missed the opportunity of serving in the military. So I couldn't ask him really what it was like at the front. But when I said this, he said that his brother had served. I forget how many years he'd served. And he said something like, oh, he was gassed twice and wounded 3 times. Yeah. He didn't have to tell me that's why he survived. But in reality, that probably did an awful lot for him, his brother, to have survived that experience. Well, let's take a look at this. Let's try to bring this over to the United States. Let's try to bring this over to America. The United States achieved a population of 200 million in about 1967. Now, as you know, as we speak, the population of the United States is well over 300 million. I think it's what, 320 million now. We've grown considerably since 1967. But we did reach 200 million in about 1967, which meant that during the Vietnam War, the United States roughly had a population of 200 million. Now, if we simply do a simple calculation, remember the United States population was 5 times that of France. But so we do a simple calculation and we look at the losses. Remember, there's about 58,000 dead in the U.S. military during the Vietnam War. Of course, France has a higher number on a smaller population. So France loses proportionally about 155 times as many men as the United States lost in Vietnam. Now, I know a number of men who died in Vietnam, several. I know a few guys who came back and killed themselves. If my experience was a rough average, and you multiply those experiences by 155 times, remember I did say earlier on that when we're thinking about who died in your school, thinking about who died, who you knew, it's not just a few guys, it's everybody in your class, everybody in class older than you, it's everybody in class younger than you as well. This gives you an idea as to the cost of the ground war, the cost of the First World War. Well, when I was in graduate school, one of my graduate schools, I was living in Washington, D.C. This is back in the 70s. This is before they built the wall. We also call it the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, D.C. Can you get something up there on this? Very fortunately, I really want to brag about this, that I've been back numerous times to Washington, D.C. since then. Love the place. Museums, they're all free. Historical sites, rent a car, drive up to Gettysburg. You can go down to Mount Vernon. I mean, this is a fantastic place to be. And I'm really glad I had the experiences of having been there for coming back numerous times, even though I lived there for about 3 years. Well, we've seen photographs of the wall. It was quite a sensation when it was first constructed. A lot of men came to mourn their friends. Now, if we were in a classroom together, I would play this little game with you. I'd say, how many of you have been to Washington, D.C.? Hands go up. How many of you have seen the wall? Hands go up. So I try to appeal to them, do I remember this correctly? I didn't see a statement anywhere when I was there about the size of the thing. So I paced it. I counted my steps. Used to be big time walker. You talk about somebody who's nuts. You're trying to make sure you have your distance correct when you're walking. You count your steps to make sure if you're planning on walking 2-3 miles a day, you end up walking that distance. So I had a pretty good idea as to the length of my stride, and I counted my steps. It's about 1/4 mile. Those of you who have been there, I'm sure some of you have been. 1/4 mile, maybe you would agree with that. About 1/4 mile here, and it comes to the corner. As I recall, they've got a person standing here. So I recall, I thought this was about 10 feet tall. You see, if you had this person standing, that's probably, what would you guess that person's 5'5", 5'9", something like that. Can you say that's like twice the size of that person? And this person is not, I think that's a lady, is not standing in the highest corner. However, it starts out fairly low, a few feet above the ground, and then it goes up to this high corner. And then as you continue to look at the names, it simply goes down the other side. That's very impressive. 58,000 names makes an awful lot of space. What if the United States had lost proportionally as many men in Vietnam as France lost in the First World War? And we decided to put all their names on a memorial. How big would that thing have to be? 16 miles long? 32 miles long? I'd have to make a little bit better calculation on that. It would have to be so high that it would keep jets from flying over. It would stretch all the way to the District of Columbia, way out into suburban Maryland. It would have to go way beyond the Potomac River on the other side, go way beyond the Pentagon, way into Virginia. The thing would absolutely be enormous. Does this give you a better idea as to the nature of the slaughter? Francis has a very bad reputation for how the war was waged, what they did. I've already talked about Elan and the attack, and I'll come back and revisit that because it is relevant in other battles which we'll be discussing later. When I was young, first reading books about all this, I remember they mentioned, a couple of books mentioned, that this was so awful that they actually shot men because of failure of an attack. Now, it might not have been these men's fault at all. They're just guys that happened to be in units that were supposed to attack. As far as I know, as far as I've been able to find out, this happened once, and it was in 1915. Men shot because, not for what they had done, but because the attack of the units had failed. So one attack, I'm trying to remember the details, so 5 companies, the attack failed. Welcome to World War I, attacks fail all the time. Because the attack failed, a general, how's your French, Gerard Revellac or whatever, said that he wants to encourage or inspire the others. So he ordered a man from each company to be chosen, usually by lot. You know what lot means, of course. A lot can often mean you have a few straws in your hand and you pull out the short one, and therefore you are the person that's chosen. Or you can put papers in a hat or a helmet in this case, and you can reach in, and if you pull out the one with an X, well, you're the man. So it's literally arbitrary. When the attack failed, Revellac ordered his own artillery to shell his own men in the trenches. Now, what do you accomplish by this? Are you going to show them that you better attack the Germans more ferociously, or we will murder you? I would argue very strongly there's a lot more going into a successful attack than men just really run head on into a machine gun. Planning might be bad, the weather might be bad. We have to take something into account. Maybe the Germans were pretty good at it that day. You ever thought of that? He ordered his artillery to shell his own men. And he was the one who ordered these men shot. Let me tell you a little bit about that. Unfortunately, my French is inadequate. I know I can get by with a little bit of French. Usually if I know what it's talking about already, I can kind of make sense of it. However, I found this in the New York Times. Once again, didn't bring my glasses. This is the New York Times, July 2nd, 1934. This was enough to make a byline even in American newspapers. The headline is French acquit 5 shot for mutiny in 1915. That's what we're talking about right here. Widows of 2 win awards of 7 cents each. Paris, July 1st, 1934. 5 war-weary soldiers chosen by lot as shot for the mutiny of their company in 1915 were vindicated today, and the widows of 2 of them received awards of 7 cents apiece. A special military tribunal acquitted the soldiers of their mutinous offenses to clear their names. For more than 10 years, the case of the 5th Company has gone from court to court as the widows of Sergeants Morange and Private Provost sought vindication. From musty, yellowing official records came the background for their suit. On April 19th, 1915, the 63rd Infantry returned to the trenches after a bloody expedition into the German lines in the Saint-Mihiel sector. That's down in the hill country by Verdun. The 5th Company, of which Sergeant Morange and Private Provost were members, was almost cut to pieces. But the 5th had the best fighting record in the regiment, and the superior command needed the men. The ranks were filled with raw recruits, who were expected to be counterbalanced by seasoned veterans. The 5th returned immediately to the front lines, while other companies rested. At the moment when the 5th returned to the front, says the official record, the German machine gunners set up a terrific and endless fire. The trenches were a living hell. The dead from the preceding attack were piled one upon the other, and there was not a foot of ground on which there was not a corpse. The officer of the 5th gave the order to go over the top. My God, under those circumstances? But the men did not move. The commanding officers met shortly afterward and decided that representatives of the whole company should be taken before the Council of War. 5 men were chosen by lot, and one from each squad. I had this wrong. I said 1 from each company. No, it was 1 from each squad. The men appeared before the council and were ordered to be killed by firing squad. When the present review court opened, one of the justices remarked that the War Council never would have sentenced the men if it had known how they were chosen. What is that, 1 franc? 7 cents each. You can say that's vindicating your husbands, but the amount of money is a little slap in the face. The French have looked at this. There's a few studies done on that. But also the English-speaking world has been introduced to this. There was an American by the name of Humphrey Cobb. Look at his dates. He was an American from the United States. However, he joined the Canadian forces and fought with the Canadians during the war. So can we say he's American/Canadian? Sure you can. He did his research on this, obviously he survived the war, and he wrote a novel called Paths of Glory, which he published in 1935. It's a good book. I don't know if it made a huge splash when it was first published. But then one of the more brilliant American filmmakers I think we've ever had. His work is very stunning. American filmmaker by the name of Stanley Kubrick took the story. They added material to it, but the basic story is absolutely correct. And they made a movie of it in 1957. Later on, if I can figure out a way of displaying this on the screen, I'm going to show you a list of motion pictures that I can remember seeing that deal with the World War I as a major theme, or at least a partial theme. And one of the list of those that I think are among the best to help you understand the nature of the war. Like I said, there's about 8 of those. One of these is Stanley Kubrick's 1957, The Paths of Glory. It's a short movie. It's an hour and a half. Now, when a class like this would meet maybe an hour and 15 minutes, and I got an hour and a half movie, I mean, I can sit and say, this is a good movie. You ought to go out and rent it. You can go down to the Orem Public Library. You ought to buy a copy. I have a couple, 3 copies. You say, why would I need a couple, 3 copies? Well, what happens if one of them gets lost? I mean, I really have to have this available. I can tell my students, go out and see these sometime. And you're busy people, and it costs $1 to rent it from the Orem Public Library. You might not get around to doing it. So I try to show this in class. I know it's going to go over 15 minutes. I apologize to my students. If you don't want to stay and see the last 15 minutes when your time is up, it's entirely up to you. You can stay or leave at your own discretion. But I will play it. I'll start at the beginning of class. And I won't take roll. If you people don't want to sit through it, that's fine with me. If you do want to see it, I want to give you the opportunity to see it. Now, I can get emotional. I do. I can talk about human loss. And remember, I did warn you very early on this semester, don't look at these as just ink on a page. These are human beings when you look at casualty figures. But there's something about reenacting something. There's something about creating a visual. And I think sometimes I have seen students that are more stimulated, if you will, to try to understand it better, having seen this film. Now, there are other brilliant films as well, but this is the one I can actually show you within the time restraints, or almost within the time restraints of the class. The film is really more about the Army at war with itself than actually at, let's see where we are here, that are actually at war with the enemy. In fact, you never see a German soldier, not even one. You don't see any German men at all. The very, very last scene in the motion picture, they have a captive German woman sing a song for the French troops. Very well done, very emotional. Well, the man who's the star of this motion picture, as you can see, is Kirk Douglas. I'm a big fan of his. He has made some very, very fine motion pictures. These scenes, there's so many scenes that are riveting. One scene, he's walking down the trench before the attack takes place, trying to look stern. The men are fidgeting, and the shells are coming over, and at the right moment, you blow your whistle, you get your pistol, get these people out, and they go out, and the German guns take care of them, cut them to shreds. The man he is portraying, a fictional character, is Colonel Dux. And Colonel Dux was a reservist, so during before the war, he was actually a defense attorney. Of course, when the war starts out, everybody's shoved in, and he's now a colonel. He tries to defend the man at court. He fails the shot. The general that ordered the attack, I think they call him Paul in the motion picture. He's actually paying this Revelat guy. They do depict this guy ordering these men shot. And he also depicts this man ordering his own artillery to shell his own men. Why? Because they had failed. What he wants out of this is an advance in rank. He's a division commander. He wants to become a corps commander. And if he can take the anthill, this position, he'll get that raise. He'll get that promotion. I said that wrong. I can't show it to you. If I tried to show it to you, remember, I tried to show you some music earlier on. If I try to show you here, I think that the sound quality would be bad, be more an effort and frustration. I hope if I tried something like this, I would not break any law. courtroom scene. Should I waste your time and try this again? Let's waste your time. Maybe I can't. Skip ad, thank you. Walking through the trenches.
Hello there, soldier. Ready to kill more Germans?
Yes, sir.
What's your name, soldier?
Sub-Private for Royal Company A.
Ah, you married, Private?
No, sir.
Well, I'll bet your mother's proud of you.
Yes, sir.
Well, carry on, Private, and good luck to you.
The din of battle's behind them.
Good morning. Hello there, soldier. Ready to kill more Germans?
Yes, sir.
Ha! Working over your rifle, I see. Well, that's the way. It's a soldier's best friend. You be good to it, and it'll always be good to you.
Yes, sir.
There's always a shell coming over.
Well, good luck to you, soldier.
Very
Carry on.
authentic.
Hello there, soldier. Ready to kill more Germans? That is, everything all right, soldier?
All right. Yes, sir, I'm all right.
Ha! Good fella. Are you married, soldier?
Married? Me married?
Yes, have you got a wife?
A wife? I got a wife?
He's a bit shell-shocked.
I beg your pardon, Sergeant. There is no such thing as shell shock. Have you got a wife, soldier?
My wife? My wife? Yes, I have a wife. I'm never going to see her again. I'm going to be killed.
Get a grip on yourself. You're acting like a coward.
I am a coward, sir.
Snap out of it, soldier. Sergeant, I want you to arrange for the immediate transfer of this baby out of my regiment. I won't have other brave men contaminated by him.
Yes, sir.
Carry on, Sergeant.
You were right, sir. The sort of thing could spread if it isn't checked.
Well, it's fascinating all the way through. I happened to spend some time, I watched, well, I take Turner Classic Movies on my dish, and I pay a lot of money for it because it's on the highest level, most expensive. Any event, I don't watch many motion pictures on it, but I do like to know about motion pictures, and I do like to see what they say about them. We have some film historians to discuss this. One of them, by the name of Mankiewicz, has praised this movie. He said, this Paths of Glory is one of Kirk Douglas's best, and it is, and Stanley Kubrick did a lot of brilliant films, but he says Paths of Glory is Stanley Kubrick's best film. Men Acquitted, 1934, which I already mentioned, they get £1 each. Now, the British futility in 1915. The British Army was small in 1914. It takes a while to build this up. And actually what the Germans were actually saying this about the British troops. They were lions led by donkeys. The Germans were very impressed with the fighting capability of the British adversaries. Even more so than the British, the Canadians and the Anzacs had a very brilliant reputation, literally among the Germans. Well, is that assessment accurate? Do you have very fine fighting men being wasted because of bad leadership? You can make a case for that. The Army grows. Remember, the Army's small in 1914, 1915 it grows. It's not until 1916 that there are more than 2 million men in the British Army. And it's going to continue to grow after that. But even though the real strong force is not available until 1916, what is available in 1915 the British really have to use to support the French ally and to try to keep Russia in the war as well. The Battle of Loos, September 25th to the 28th, 1915. The British bring out their tubes to release gas. We read our sources. The wind was supposed to go over to the Germans. The wind changed directions, came back, and blew back on the British trenches. They were not prepared for this, and end up having something like 2,000 gas casualties. That's not fatalities, but these are men who are incapacitated at least for a certain length of time. A good example of what goes wrong or can go wrong in the use of gas. In this period of time, there were 10,000 men that attacked, 10,000 British men. Some accounts say that part of this attack, different battalions, you'd actually have these men almost lined up in a square, where you have men come into the trench and they go forward, have another men come in and fill that trench and they go forward. So you're kind of going in a direct mass, a direct assault. The German machine guns. There was one battalion that attacked German machine gun positions. There's two machine guns. The battalion was literally cut to shreds. Just literally had no chances. Hundreds of men laid out. All other books will say different things. You'll see some books will say 75%. Some books will say 80%. I shouldn't really quibble with percentages, but whatever it is, it's very high. Very high indeed. We were talking, I mentioned earlier in this discussion, an autobiography, Goodbye to All That. Remember, the author was saying that he was the one I was telling you about. Get him up again. By Robert Graves. Well, maybe you better have Robert Graves up there rather than the book. This autobiography has been criticized, but give you a look at him. Here he is in uniform. Book has been criticized, a little poetic license involved, but I'm not going to argue with the main arguments. Now, in 1915, the Battle of Loos, he's a lieutenant. He's over a platoon, 30, 40 men. And he's ordering his men up. Let's go up. Well, the fire is really heavy. So he orders his men to go to ground. In other words, hit the dirt. You get down, you get lower so you don't get killed as much. But when you get down, then obviously you're not fighting. You're supposed to advance. So after a brief period of time, Graves gets up and says, we're going to attack. Let's go assault the enemy. He gets up. He yells to his men, get up and assault. Nobody moves. Graves gets angry. He says unkind things to them. He calls them cowards. He insults them. After a few minutes of this, his sergeant, who has a broken shoulder, probably from a bullet, said, sir, they're all dead. When he ordered them to go to ground, he didn't have to order them to go to ground. They were just simply slaughtered with a machine gun. Bad idea, sure. They haven't figured out how to deal with machine guns. They haven't figured out how to deal well with the artillery. They haven't figured out how to pinpoint the enemy during an attack. The slaughter was so horrific that the Germans quit firing on them. After the initial advance, and the Germans just mowing them down. And then, of course, you have to, if you can, the survivors try to limp back. Many of the survivors, very large percent of survivors, are wounded. It's hard to imagine there's a situation like this, that many of the people were actually were whole and well. But anyway, they were trying to bring their wounded back. They were trying to bring them back to the original positions. The Germans simply quit firing. They could have mowed them down. The Germans actually felt sorry for them. One of the more famous men who was actually killed at Loos was Jack Kipling, also known as John Kipling. Can we get him up here? He is the only son of a famous British poet by the name of Rudyard Kipling. I don't know what they're doing to you nowadays growing up versus what they did to us. We actually read his Just So stories, Rudyard Kipling's Just So stories, when I was in grade school, which includes, of course, his reason of why leopards got their spots. I mean, something an adult would have a hard time reading and appreciating. Small children, oh, that's kind of cute. Rudyard Kipling was a big proponent of colonialism. Do I have some of his poems down here? Yeah, Gunga Din, one of your more famous poems. Though I've beaten and I've flayed you by the living God that made you, you're a better man than I am, Gunga Din. White Man Burden, I think, is kind of putrid. It's talking about men, about nations. It's dedicated to the United States and our conquest of the Philippines, in which they say that, oh, you're doing this for the moral reasons. You're killing people for moral reasons. Okay, you're bringing them your justice. Your justice of shooting them down if they resist. I mean, okay, it's high-minded, but I think its sympathy is misspent. My sympathy is for the people being victimized by colonial powers, not for the colonial powers themselves. One of his macho poems. It's actually dedicated to his son. You see, short, even before he had a son, he dedicated this to his son. Let's see, how about I do it right? Rudyard Kipling's If. Do I have it here? I love the Poetry Foundation. This is advice to the son he hasn't had yet, but of course, this is going to make a big deal when he does have a son. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing them and blaming it on you. If you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, but make allowance for the doubting too. If you can wait not to be tired of waiting, or being lied about, do not deal in lies. Or being hated, don't give way to hating. And yet don't look too good, nor walk too wise. There's a whole bunch of stanzas here. Come down to the last one. If you can walk with crowds and keep your virtue, or walk with kings nor lose the common touch. If neither foes nor loving friends can hurt you, if all men count with you, but none too much. If you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the earth and everything that's in it. And which is more, you'll be a man, my son. Macho, right? Be a man. You can put up with everything, right? He has one son. What's the son, 18 in 1914? 17? Kipling doesn't serve. He's an old guy by this time. But his son has to serve. He has to be in it. Rudyard Kipling's concerned. What if this thing ends and my son's not in it? See, I'm the big proponent of war. I'm the big proponent of colonialism. My son has to be there. He has to. You see, we have to be very, very careful. A lot of people want to justify themselves by how they manipulate or control their children. My kids are growing up, they're all raised now, but you know something? It's their choice, not mine. If I'm going to justify myself, maybe I better do something in my life. This is not uncommon. But to justify Rudyard Kipling, Jack has got to serve. Now, Jack has some problems. He has eyesight problems. I'd like to see him in glasses. Young, handsome man, as you can see. Initially, when he tries to join, or his father has him try to join, he's turned down. The guy has eyesight problems. This is not the guy that you need up in the trenches. But Kipling's a famous man. So he pulls strings and manipulates. So he gets his son made an officer and stuck in a unit. He was sent out at the Battle of Los, and his body was never found. Not from a lack of trying. Even after the war, Rudyard Kipling tried to go back and talk to the men who were in the units, who was with him, to say, well, where did he actually, when was the last time he saw him? He actually pokes around the battlefield. I think several years after his son was killed, the chances of finding anything is very, very low. Rudyard Kipling mourned the rest of his life for the loss of his son. What I would speculate is largely two things. Either his son was obliterated by a shell, come over and blew him all over the place, so there's nothing really left to find, or the corpse was laying out in a shell hole, and rather than try to bring back a corpse, somebody put dirt over it, not even knowing who he was. He got his son killed. Now, let's be, in all fairness to Rudyard Kipling, let's look at this man's life. He's young, vigorous man. If he hadn't gone in the service and been killed in 1915, well, certainly they would have looked at his eyesight problem later on when they needed more men, and winked at that, shall we say, bad pun, and decided to let him in. So if he hadn't been killed at Los in 1915, he would have been killed at the Somme in 1916. If he hadn't been killed there in 1916, 1917, he probably would have been killed at Passchendaele. If he had survived Passchendaele, well, there's the most brutal war, year of the entire war, 1918, and he probably would have been killed then too. But how well did Kipling believe that he made a severe problem by pushing his kid into war? Did he really think this was going to justify his own manhood by getting his son killed? There's an example in the United States, another example. I'm sure you're all familiar with the President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, also known as Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt, I'd have to look up his dates, I think he was born just before the Civil War started. And he was a child, he said one of his earliest memories, like 1865, when the men were marching back to New York. His father was military age, his father never served. Something that Teddy Roosevelt couldn't forgive, his father didn't serve. See, Teddy Roosevelt thinks that the only way you can justify yourself as a man is to serve in the military. In the Spanish-American War, 1898, Teddy Roosevelt's involved in combat, Battle of San Juan Hill, tacks up, kills a man with a pistol, and was quite pleased. He wrote about it later again. Really? Well, Teddy Roosevelt had 4 sons. They're going to serve. All 4 of them are in the First World War. This is not behind the lines. Teddy Roosevelt makes sure they're in combat. The youngest, was his name Kermit? What, he 20 years of age? He was in the Air Corps, flew around, got killed. The other 3 sons served. One of those sons, see, all 3 of them, all 4 served in the First World War. The 3 surviving sons served in the Second World War. One of whom died. He had a heart attack in the Normandy invasions, was not killed by the enemy. Another committed suicide. He was so psychologically disturbed from the First World War, and he's still psychologically hurt in the Second World War. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore and killed himself. The other son, I believe, was he wounded both in World War I and World War II? You see, it's not just the British that are thinking that manliness means you have to serve, but Americans were as well. Going back to Teddy Roosevelt, I believe the youngest son, I believe his name Kermit, who was killed July 1918. And I don't know how it is. Sometimes people say, oh, they have the favorite child. Well, apparently he was the favorite child. And so Teddy Roosevelt mourned severely for this, but he never said it was a bad idea. However, let's go back to Rudyard Kipling. If any question why we died, this is Kipling again. If any question why we died, tell them because our fathers lied. It takes the death of a son for Rudyard Kipling to learn that pushing men into the military and going to war is not a good idea. There's a movie made about this in 2007 called My Boy Jack. It's a good film. It's not one of the super good ones. It's certainly worth seeing. In fact, the death scene is pretty dramatic. He runs out and sense gets shot with a machine gun, though we don't know how he died. But it does talk about Kipling, Rudyard Kipling, pushing his son into the military, how his son reacted to it, and the mourning, at least the starting of the mourning, that Rudyard Kipling had for his son. Good movie we're seeing. Now, Sir John French was the head of the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF. We already met him at the Battle of Mons. We've also mentioned him briefly at the Battle of Marne. He's still in the British Army, is getting bigger and bigger, in 1915. Now, the argument was this, that he is not a good commander. I don't think he was. Is he really flawed in any real sense? I'm not really saying that either. But he wasn't terribly brilliant, wasn't terribly good commander, made mistakes in battles. At the Battle of Loos, for example, was argued that rather than bringing up appropriate support troops, in reality, he hung back a little bit too much. So they didn't arrive in time. Now, French is going to say this, that one of the reasons why he was not more successful is the shell shortage. Going all the way back to 1914, remember I said that the fighting slowed. One of the reasons why the fighting slowed was, which I didn't make a big deal over, was they're out of ammunition. Nobody in their wildest imagination could foresee the amount of artillery pieces, the amount of shells they would actually need to fight this war. They were shooting off what many planners thought would take weeks to shoot off. They're shooting these off in a matter of days. Of course, you ratchet up production as rapidly as you possibly can. But even that, until you really get your industry heated up, and that takes months, you still don't have enough shells. So in 1915, French says, we don't have enough shells. That's one of the reasons why we are not successful. The shell shortage. This becomes a big scandal, ends up in the press, and people are saying, who's responsible for this? And we need to have more industry. And they do. They ratchet up their industry quite considerably. The Allies, the British and the French, have a big advantage, which the Germans do not have. American munition makers in the United States, wow, they can make money. So the French and the British are sending these big orders over to the United States. We need more shells, among other things. Rifles, small arms weapons, bullets, shells, artillery shells. We need that. The United States industry ratchets itself up, and you're getting large amounts of supplies, not only being produced in France and Britain, but coming from the United States as well. Can we say the shell shortage really disappears in 1915? But French is replaced. He kind of has a bad reputation. He's a womanizer. He likes to chase skirts. The man who replaces him is Douglas Haig, who, well, he likes women, but he's not chasing them around. Can we say the real reason why French is replaced is not necessarily failure, though failure was involved. It's not necessarily the shell shortage, though I think that was a factor, but later on it disappears. His biggest single problem is he doesn't have enough friends in high places. Douglas Haig is also a disastrous leader, I believe. We'll talk about him later. There is some controversy among British historians about his skill and his effectiveness. But he led the British to huge casualties, to disastrous defeats. to unconscionable slaughter. That's why I have him up here as a butcher. I think he was. Well, if French is replaced, why wasn't Haig replaced? Once again, it's politics. The second prime minister in Britain during the First World War, David Lloyd George, who took over from Asquith after a couple of years, really did not like Douglas Haig. Would have loved to have removed him. But Haig simply has too many friends. Now, the command structure in the British Army, you have the British, and this is usually the way it works. You have a number of nationalities involved, Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, among some other colonial troops. But the overall commander is going to be somebody from the nation with the largest number of men. Obviously, there's a lot more British there than Canadian or Anzacs. So the British are going to be in command. So it's the British that are going to give orders to the Canadians, Australians, and New Zealanders as to where they will stand in defense, where they will go in offense. And as we look at the casualty figures, remember, the Australians and New Zealanders don't really arrive on the Western Front until they've been withdrawn from Gallipoli, not really until 1916. So they come a little bit later into the game than many other British forces. Can we say that these troops have higher losses proportionally than the British? I had an interesting conversation with an old friend of mine. Unfortunately, he's been long ago dead. His name is Phil Flammer. I think I've already mentioned him to you. He wrote a very, very good book on the Lafayette Escadrille, the U.S. people, U.S. men, that volunteered to fly combat missions for France in the air. The guy is a World War I historian. We had fun conversations, very interesting. Anyway, I brought this up and said many of these people from Canada, Australia, New Zealand are looking at themselves and saying that we suffered because of the British wanted to use us and not other people. And he didn't deny that. On the other hand, he did come back and say, well, these are your best troops. When you have the best troops, you're going to give them the hardest jobs to do. Okay, factor. Could it also be callousness? That you'd rather lose these people from other countries rather than from your own country? Who are the best troops in the war? Well, these are the best. We usually say the best two armies to fight in the First World War were the British and the Germans. And of the British forces, the best units were Canadian, Australia, and New Zealand. I don't have a good explanation for this. Usually when we talk about the strength of the British, the German army, for example, we do have a tendency to talk about discipline, iron discipline, and you do what you're told, and of course you have a heavy German industry behind you. You have these large military traditions. So we can explain the Germans being good and sometimes very good on the basis of that. How do we explain the Australians? Many historians will say the best combat troops anywhere in the world during the First World War, Second World War, actually the entire 20th century, are the Australians. They did stunning work in the First World War, stunning work in the Second World War. And in Vietnam, they were extremely good as well. They were actually better than the Americans. How do I explain this? Not in nature of discipline. I can't explain from the nature of discipline. Because these guys are very famously being undisciplined. They play rugby, one of the more brutal sports, I think, out there. Does this help explain? I remember there was when one of my roommates at Utah State went out and played rugby. And I didn't go to watch that time. I've seen a few rugby matches since then. And one of the guys called rugby a free-for-all with a ball. In other words, boom. And as you look at the rugby, and I've watched this a few times, like on TV, and I've seen a few matches in person. Guys are actually doing this, standing across from each other, bam, not in the face, but the kind of thing. It's a very rough game. When I was in the Navy, one of the guys in my unit was a power lifter. Boom. My goodness, this guy was built. I mean, strong arms, strong shoulders. I asked him about that. Oh man, I love this. You go down to the weight room for hours, and yeah, it takes a little while to get that buff. Guy was very, very buff. Now I was in the reserves, but before he was in the reserves, he was actually in the Navy. And one of the things that he did was in the Pacific Fleet, obviously. He went down to Australia, and he went to a bar, and okay, you're in the Navy. Well, let's drink a little, right? Goes into a bar. Some guy walks up to him and says, "Hey, mate, want a tiff?" Now, if you're going to poke a fight in a bar, don't go to a power lifter, okay? The guy has some advantages potentially. Of course, my friend said, "Well, sure, why not?" So they're rolling around. Hopefully they weren't pounding each other in the face. They're whacking around on the floor. I don't know who won. I don't know if there was a victor. But when the Australian stood up and says, "Hey, mate, you're all right," you had to prove yourself by tussling in a bar. Let me confess to something. I feel bad about this to this day. I was teaching the World War I class, and we're talking about the various strengths, and one guy raised his hand. It was a very good question. He says, "Why are the Germans so good?" Man, I wish I had answered that question. Do you know what I said? I said, "Well, why are the Australians better than the Germans?" See, that didn't answer his question, did it? These guys are good. These guys are very good, and they die in very large numbers. Let me tell you another story when I'm shooting my mouth off. My wife and I would like to go to buffets, cheap, anything you want. Over at Pizza Pie Buffet in Orem. And I walk in, and there's this guy, and he's got the strongest Australian accent. First time I saw him, I said, "Oh, that's interesting, Australian." Second time I came in, he's got an accent. I said, "You from Australia?" He says, "No." Okay, he can say what he wants to say, but I have an Australian accent. I'm going, well, I didn't believe him, obviously. And I like to leave tips because I don't want to act like a cheap guy. Usually in a buffet, people don't leave tips. They bust your tables with $2. Anyway, I pulled out my wallet, pulled out a $5 bill. I handed it to him and said, "Look, I know what you did in the First World War. I know what you did in the Second World War. I know what you did in Vietnam. I can't give money to those people, but I can give it to you. Let me, in the name of your country, let me offer you a little tip." It would have bothered me had I not done that. In my entire lifetime, I have only met and got to know, one or two or three Australians, very small number. However, as a student employee, I had a man from Australia. And he was a funny guy. He had a good sense of humor. And he actually told me about rugby. For a while, he was the head of BYU women's rugby team. So he knew the game quite well. I wish I had pressed him a little bit more, but at least he said this in a conversation. He said to me, talking about how much he hated the British, "If I saw an Englishman on fire," this is not the term he used, but this is what it means. "If I saw an Englishman on fire, I would not urinate on him to put him out." Now that's a good intro, and I asked him about this. He said, "Oh, it's not just me. It's a very typical attitude of Australians." The next question is pressing him, "Why do you hate the English so much?" This is not the only thing that was mentioned, but he did mention British command that got these guys killed, both in the First and Second World Wars. So there's animosity, there's feelings even today. Am I out of time? Yes, I am. I'd like to tell you one other silly story, but I'll have to wait until next time. In the meantime, enjoy your day and have the greatest time ever, and see Paths of Glory sometime. Catch you later.